Welcome back to High Performance Computing and our lecture 10 on parallel and scalable machine and deep learning. So today we will really basically do just interesting initial steps for machine learning, and then we will look a little bit on parallel and scalable machine learning right now in the second part. But of course we have two more practical lectures coming up, practical lecture 10.1 that looks much more into deep learning techniques, and then practical lecture 10.2 that then think about distributed training of deep learning. And in the first part of the lecture today, we really had the fundamentals, the foundations of machine learning. We had the areas of classification, clustering, regression, what are the differences. We had the idea of a supervised learning approach, where we have always a given input vector X with a guiding output Y that we can use in different many algorithms. So not only we have seen the simple perceptron learning model that we use with the perceptron learning algorithm, we also can use more elaborate models like logistic regression, for instance, that you have seen there, where essentially you have a cost function that you try to minimize, and where you not only, let's say, add or subtract a vector, but also have an optimization approach. And optimization basically is a technique inherent in very many machine learning algorithms. Minimizing a problem is meant, for instance, when we talk about optimization in this area, and by minimizing the error, for instance, that we have as a training samples that you have right now. This is, of course, one of the goals in many of the machine learning algorithms that especially are the more advanced ones. So although this is quite interesting material, this course is not a machine learning course. It just gives you now the application area of machine learning, and should also point to the fact, where is HPC required? Why HPC is so much intertwined with AI, with artificial intelligence, with deep learning these days. So we start a little bit again with classification. That's what you already know from the first part of the lecture. And from there, we will dive into a different model that we basically have already alluded to, called the support vector machine. Teaching support vector machines alone would take 2 to 3 lectures. So also here, the idea is not that you completely understand support vector machines, although I encourage you to really think about it. It's a very interesting approach. And if you remember, the key idea is a little bit explained here, where if you have this kind of two different colors of classes, again here very simple as a kind of binary classification problem, you can come up with different lines. So the question you can ask is, what is the best line here to differentiate the data? Would it be this, this, or that? And I think your gut feeling would say somehow it is most likely this, because if you remember what machine learning, what was data classification doing? It wants to predict a new data item, right, that is coming here or here. So in the sense of putting the decision boundary very close to the green part, you would say there's a kind of likelihood that maybe here still very highly likely to get the next green point, or here it's very likely to get the next red point. So putting the decision boundary too close, essentially to the points, would mean there's no buffer. And the buffer is something what you would see here a little bit visualized, which is then really basically also some people refer to as a street, right? Essentially saying you want to have the maximum distance between the points and the decision points on both sides of the classes. So hence you have an optimization problem here of thinking, what is the best line that maximizes the distance between the points here on this interesting area of the street, or on the edge of the street. And then basically you're very well prepared for future points like here, red and green, because there's the highly likelihood that basically this still with the buffer enables you to classify them correctly. And so this requires quite some computing. There's a parallel algorithm for it that we're using. The idea of how support vector machines work is, of course, in different publications here. The one that gave rise to is with Vapnik, and other Cortis here, but also here Big Data Tips, SVM Train. There are lots of sources which tell you how an SVM really works. We used it a lot for remote sensing data sets. Hence, you have here also publications in this area where we essentially used the parallel SVM. You see that here, how you basically use it. with the training data and then also with the testing data once the model is formed. And also this understanding, something I want to show you a little bit, is this second part. So it's not only about parallel computing, but also what is now the ingredients of training data, test data, what is a model, and so forth. So you see we are using here 4 nodes up to 96 tasks just for the training, and the classes basically that you can use SVMs for need not to be binary. So you see here an interesting example of this land cover classes, which are buildings, blocks, roads, satellite images, which have been already classified, right? So this is a label, these colorings, saying that each of the pixel we have in the real image is essentially already classified into these different classes. So we have a 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 class problem here. And this is a supervised learning problem with this. And you can now think about that this is data set. You want to test it maybe once you trained the model, once you optimize it and compare always the error, then you want to test it with data which was not involved in the training. So you keep away also some test data. That's the usual procedure in machine learning. You would add also a validation data set if you have, let's say, big data, in order to perform model selection. And if you swim in data, you can even have several of those validation data sets. But here for the simple, let's say, approach of CSVM, all you need is a training data set. Then we have a PSVM train, which uses MPI underneath with, let's say, the data set, the training data set, and using here some parameters, which are not so important now for you to understand. Some of them are kernel parameters, meaning G is referring to the RBF kernel in support vector machines. And here's a C100 just tells you how much error you should allow. There's a measure that you can also allow some error, even if you train. And let's say a green one is in the space where you not would typically basically have a green point sitting or expecting. But if it's just 1 point or 2 points and the all remaining green points would be on the correct side of the margin, as it is called here, maximum margin classifier is another word for the support vector machines. And also the idea of having only linear boundaries is also not really fully true. If the kernel is there, which requires a complete other lecture, we can also go to very sophisticated decision boundaries in higher level space using so-called basically kernel methods. But for the basic understanding, this is again a typical classification task that you have learned. So there's a training data set that we cut the basically training samples in, and the test data set, and all of them have the same part. So basically all of them have their nature of the point itself, but also, or the nature of the pixel here in the example, and then the class, if it is a building, if it's a tram or water or so forth. So then you have seen machine learning models are quite rich. So we have by now also the perceptual learning model understood. We now know the support vector machine learning model. We have logistic regression models. And soon you will also explore deep learning networks, basically neural networks, shallow networks. So all of them are considered to be those machine learning models. And if you have the supervised learning problem, you would have a labeled data set that was again this kind of point vector, which gives the attributes about a certain point, whatever it might be. Could be the point of a, let's say, land cover you have just seen, a remote sensor, but could be also, as we have seen in the flower, the attributes of the petal and sepal. Important in supervised learning is then this given output Y. It's associated to each of the different points, telling you always it is a tram, or it's a building, or it's water in the case of the remote sensing problem. Now, important for you to understand is that we not really want to memorize all of this. So the goal of going through all of these data sets, doing this again and again, is something you can consider a little bit like you are training for the exam, right? You want to get your error in sample down. So all of the material you have for your learning, also the quizzes we have, gives a little bit of help by doing it iteratively again and again to get your error in sample down. But what you really want to achieve is then in your exam, you want to have a good grade. So this is questions you actually never have seen, right? So this is a new exam coming to you, but based on the quizzes you have, based on the material of the lectures we have, you already worked your, let's say, error so much down that you generalize well for the exam. So this is machine learning terminology for a very practical problem here, why you should train for exam and actually start soon in order to get ready for exam. It's coming up. And in order to check for this, as I told you with the quizzes, it is essential to not use the quizzes only, for training, for getting your error down, because essentially it's large material in the lectures. So consider that all as a training set, and then you just test your knowledge with the quizzes. Otherwise, you run in danger that you memorize rather all the quiz questions, and then you're very much prepared and think, okay, I know all the quiz questions by heart, and then I go to the exam and I will fail because only a couple of questions may be coming again or are reformulated, but there was a huge amount of material which is maybe not essentially in the quizzes. Hence, machine learning always uses these two data sets. Now, the tricky question is how big they are. So in other words, where is the dividing line here? So do I 50%, others do 10% training, 90% test? If you can, of course, it would be good to keep the training size small so that you always can test very well your knowledge. However, there's something in statistical learning theory, meaning you need a certain number of samples for a given model to really work well. We call this a model capacity. If it's a very complicated model, you need more data to train it. So 10% might be not enough. So you have to increase it to 20% or 30%. And nobody really tells you these numbers. It's something which is usually an application domain problem, experience in different application domains in order to differentiate this or that data set. And as I said earlier, if you really have big data available, then you can come to a third cut, a fourth cut, or fifth cut even, and throw away, as we would call it, in the corner, validation data sets together with the test sets. Because essentially when you create such a model that we have seen for classification, all you should use is always a training set. Once you basically do model selection and you get the parameters right, you would take these validation sets out of the corner and use them for model selection, each model parameter at a time. And once you set the model parameters, you have learned, but you as a human learn, so it's a bias in the data set. So you cannot essentially reuse it. So the validation set becomes contaminated. Hence, you should have many of those to make more parameter decisions. But of course, there are problems sometimes that you don't have so much data, especially in scientific and engineering environments. We often found that we're not really swimming in data. We have lots of data, but not in a supervised fashion. We would have large, let's say, images with extreme high resolutions, and we want to identify pixel-wise what's happening in this image. But only a couple of pieces actually of this image are already, let's say, labeled, so we know what the class would be. And this is a problem, especially in science and engineering, but also here and there in industry. Now you better understand the idea of a training set, of a testing set. Now, when we put this to the larger picture, you come to this interesting point. And we do this also to understand now finally, where is the high performance computing? Where is the need for computing here? So machine learning, if you want, basically is learning from data, as we said. So this is a key ingredient, the training examples. This is something that we must have, otherwise we cannot do anything in machine learning. We have basically here the labeled samples, here an example in remote sensing, the land cover. You will hear also more from in practical lecture 10.1 and practical lecture 10.2. So by doing this training samples, what we want to find out is there a function that actually created, so to speak, these training examples? So this is called as the unknown target function. That would be the ideal function. The trouble is we would never know it. If we would know it, then we didn't bother with machine learning. Then we would go ahead and implement it, of course, for future points. Hence, the idea is a little bit like statisticians would call function approximation. So you want to basically find a function that is, creating these training examples or reproduce them. And they're usually coming out of some probability distribution. So this gives you a little bit the context of saying, of course, a machine learning model needs to be put to a certain problem. In other words, maybe as an application example would be, if you have all the movies that you basically have looked in Netflix, and you basically then have a kind of vector here, X, which gives you all the movies and gives you all the, let's say, properties of the movies, and you learn from them, and you basically can from then predict what would be your next movie, then it would be a trained model that, of course, doesn't work for any other probability distribution, for any other application domain problem necessarily. So you cannot just now basically put it to Amazon Prime. It probably wouldn't work, or because it has another probability distribution, even if there are still movies behind it, maybe they encode different features. So this is something very important, that we keep, of course, the models to the application domain problem at hand. On the other hand, then this is something what you can use for training, but you also see in machine learning the trouble we have every now and then is essentially what we can call an unknown target distribution rather. So given this probability that I just described, the key issue with this is that essentially you will have sometimes, and that's where we leave a little bit the typical function area. So the target function is not good enough, because we would sometimes find in the movie maybe that you looked, that you rated them, let's say with Y as a label, sometimes differently. So in other words, you would have the same vector X in and different Y out. Again, you would have the same X in, but different Y out. And for those of you that are not so mathematically inclined, this means it's not anymore really a function, right? So this is something where machine learning faces data sets which are not fully in line of a function. So just function approximation in this sense is not enough. We rather put a probability around this and say P of X given Y, and then basically always consider some noise in the data set when we think about this, function that we want to find. How we find the function is something that you already experienced in the perceptual learning algorithm. So this was a linear learning model where we basically summed up the data set linearly using weights. And by doing so, we came to a function. And we played around with the functions quite hectically by subtracting or adding a vector, which was really this learning algorithm, because the real model was a perceptron learning model that we took out of the hypothesis set, which was then the linear function or this linear learning model. So here now we have the support vector machine. So we have a very similar approach. We would say we pick from the hypothesis not anymore logistic regression or linear regression or perceptron learning model. We would take a support vector machine model. Now you basically give this in together with the labeled samples, and you have a certain learning algorithm which is behind support vector machines called quadratic programming. There are different implementations that we have basically looked at. One of them that we have in parallel and used here in the parallel implementation is, interestingly enough, sequential minimal optimization. And you hence have, again, the optimization problem. You have also seen in one of the videos, for instance, before, and we will always have the idea of the error measure. So this cost function to put down the error, because in the end, what you want to achieve is some final formula that really works with the data and gives you almost something like you would have here on the top, right? The target function that we would never know, but it should approximate it quite well, which would be then our final hypothesis. In order to get there, we have to knock down the error measure, which is essentially the learning process. And by doing this iteratively again and again, and hence here's now the HPC, the computing, usually the learning takes a lot of time. It depends on which algorithms. So logistic regression is, let's say, relatively straightforward still. But when you have deep learning algorithms and, let's say, classes of 50 and plus, like in some of those remote sensing problems, then you really have lots of computational footprint in this step. Once you have the function and you want to use it with a new data point, we call that inference or testing essentially. Then of course this is very cheap. It's just one data point or a couple of data points and you actually compute a function because you just learned the function. So this is computation not so intensive, but training and optimizing essentially such a function and is in the learning algorithm often. And this basically is equally valid for machine learning in terms of neural network that would have backpropagation of error along and basically through the hidden layers. You have, as I said, support vector machines with quadratic programming. there are always these kind of two combinations. So this gives you a bigger overview of the problem of machine learning. We have here a problem of saying overfitting, and interestingly enough, it's a phenomena where many of the non-experienced people run in incredibly often. So we just said in the perceptual learning algorithm, we just have to do lots of iterations in order to perform the classification, in order to create the classification, in order to create the decision boundary that works. Now, in this case, this was a very specific algorithm that worked, and also because the data was not, linear, it was linearly separable data in that time. But basically, when you do this with other learning models, you come to an effect called overfitting. So essentially, you start memorizing the data. You basically make the data so much fit to the model that you have really problems of generalizing to unseen data sets. So your decision boundary will be so oriented towards all the data points that at a certain point, you would say it's important for us to keep the error down. That's what the learning algorithms will do, right? They will knock down this training error over time when you have lots of training time. But there will be a sweet spot where we not only take any more about bad generalization, but where we say that when we use it in the out of sample, which is here the out, so data we have never seen, it suddenly goes up again because the model is too much trimmed to the training set. It is not generalizing well also to the test set. And this is a phenomena called overfit, that at some point in time, the out of sample performance will go up again. And this is, of course, what we should avoid. So this is not an easy question now to avoid this. So there are different approaches to prevent essentially this overfitting. Two general approaches that we would say is firstly regularization and then also validation techniques. All of those together might be 4 or 5 lectures. So again, I cannot go really in these lectures here towards it. Basically on my website, I have different teaching material around this. If you're interested, here is also Stain is using, basically having also a machine learning course offered here at the university. So basically, I encourage you when you find this interesting, but this is something really you have to learn. It reaches also to, let's say, aspects of statistical learning theory that, of course, this pace of overfitting significantly also depends how much data do you have for the model in question. An example would be deep learning or neural networks, right? So they can be heavily trimmed because there are lots of parameters that you can train, that you can justify. And if you dare basically do lots of training again and again with the same data set in the training data, you will see also overfitting happening. So to avoid this, there's a so-called validation technique, as I told you, as one idea. The other one is regularization, which is usually within the models and incorporated. We see that in basically the support vector machine. It has certain penalties inside. We have this always in the areas of machine learning that we can add them or basically get rid of them in neural networks here, which could be another hypothesis set, right? So we have the hypothesis set here, how machine learning would think about, as we said in the beginning, that is all the formulas I know, perceptual learning algorithms, support vector machines, neural networks. So for neural networks, for instance, I could also pick now how many neurons are in the hidden layers, how many hidden layers I have. These are all questions alluding to different, let's say, hypotheses here. And all of them I have to give in, and this should be giving you now the perspective not only how machine learning works, with all of this different data set, it also gives you again the footprints of computing and why high performance computing can be always beneficial in many different areas and many different situations. So first of all, you see, we pick here one hypothesis in order to get this G. If you remember, this was hopefully approximate F, this function we will never know quite well. And we use it with a training data set, right? Okay, that's what we know. So we train it, and this is already computation intensive. So essentially now you do this not with one support vector machines because you want to maybe modify the cost parameter, you want to modify the kernel parameter, and you maybe add a couple of neural networks to it as different hypotheses. So you come maybe up with M equals 20, right? So you have maybe many different hypotheses you want to check, and all of them you have to train with a training set in order to get a trained model. Let it be a trained support vector machines, or basically you have then the neural network where all the weights here that you see between them are trained. More neural networks will be coming in the next lecture, really from practical lecture 10.1 given by Gabriel Cavallaro. He will give you more details about this. So here, just for the abstract idea of why computing is so essential here. So you could use HPC already for each of those in training. And of course, if they are parallel algorithms like our parallel PSVM, you benefit here once within the training process of having a parallel SVM. But of course, you can benefit of also parallelizing the process of all of them, learning them also in parallel, right? So you have a twofold parallelism here of saying not only inherently in the training algorithms, also all the different trainings, the SVMs, the artificial neural networks can be done in parallel. Now, when you essentially do the training, the next step you would have, if you have a validation data set, you have to validate this. So again, essentially you have to pick, let's say, a couple of those which have shown, let's say, an interesting, basically an interesting way of getting accuracy when you test it with a test data set a little bit. So it's not yet formal. You will evaluate them a little bit, let's say, informally. But once you have identified a couple of those which are interesting, you should try starting the validation data set to validate the parameter set. In other words, you perform a model selection. So maybe you have identified 3 support vector machines that all work particularly well for your application problem. So you're somewhere around basically here, right, before overfitting, and you essentially then would basically pick one of those and pick the best. Now, by picking the best, we call you have done something for the machine. So you as a human have learned something. You picked this parameter set from this particular hypothesis. And with this deval, this validation data set, which is out of sample of detrained, so it's a different data set. So this can be not anymore really used. So you have to throw that away because it has a kind of bias in it. So every time you do a model decision, essentially you contaminate a bit the data set. Once you have performed this validation and you pick the best and have done this, the good thing is to put everything back in the pod again and then basically do the final training on the full data set. And if you basically are in doubt, you can use the validation samples also too. In other words, we have a little bit of bias, but we swallow it because in the light of the overall data, the bias is still a little bit small. And basically using then the final training, or basically the final training here of the whole data set, and would use again deval, you will come to a test accuracy which is, let's say, not realistic. It would be much higher reported than it really is. Let's say from 80%, what you think it is, it would fall down to 60%, just because you used essentially the things that have been involved before in training and essentially in the deval. And if you just keep on doing this and then also testing essentially not on proper data sets, let's say a testing data set should be always somewhere in the corner, right, which has never been used here in the trainings, then this would be, of course, important too. So this is the validation technique here. And you see the training has computational footprint, then the validation, the final training has computational footprint. We see essentially in twofold parallelism here. So within the training, you have a parallel support vector machine, for example, but also neural networks, as you will see in subsequent practical lectures, can be nicely parallelized today. So this is one form of inherent, let's say, parallelizing the algorithm. But then, of course, as we're never sure with all the parameters we can steer in these, how many neurons, how many hidden layers, we always have the problem, which in former times also people were referring to a grid search to really find the parameters of all this different, let's say, different hypotheses, and then pick one for your real application problem, which is then this GM star. So again, this means a lot of computing. And there's a certain technique which is also there, let's say, again, to the rescue, if you're not swimming in validation data sets. So as I said in the previous kind of slide, which is, of course, already a kind of advanced slide because it captures the essence of how you do proper machine learning. The other trouble you run into in many of your application domains will be that there is just not enough data to put it aside, a test data set that you always need, a training data set that you always need, and then also on top of it, validation data set. This has something to do with the number of samples that are available, maybe for your problem, because we need also quite some of them for training. You cannot just, train on a couple of examples and test on all the others or validate on all the others. So you need a certain number of training examples also to train your model well. Otherwise, you see it a little bit like here when you think the training time, you will come to a situation that you are in a bad generalization space. You didn't properly have knocked down the error of learning. In other words, you didn't really learn yet very much. Of course, there's a sweet spot when you too much learn. But as I said here, you will basically have mechanisms like regularization that prevent essentially that you learn the data by heart, and so validation, where you then have essentially a systematic approach of picking then the right model. In order to put a systematic over it, especially if you're not swimming data sets, there's a certain technique called cross-validation, and this is a little bit explained here. And the interesting thing is, again, for us here in the HPC course, not going too much maybe into deep learning or in other, let's say, areas, or so, because we also want to highlight here a little bit today what is a high performance computing footprint again, in this specific idea of how you do validation, right? So validation, if you don't have a validation data set, you still can create essentially with this technique your validation set, but in a fold manner to keep the bias of the decision that you will do relatively slim and small. So this is something where we have all the training examples, but we want to do, for instance, in a so-called 10-fold cross-validation, which is very popular. You basically train on 9 and validate on the 10th. But as you do this fold, you go through this data set basically 10 times and fold it always in a systematic fashion. And by doing so, you essentially, of course, have now the aspect of the computing again. You not only once go through the training examples, right, to train it. So here you basically always, you train it on 9, and the last one will be then used for checking. Then you take the next one and the next one and the next one for checking, and train on the others not used for checking. So in other words, you have much more computing power required for this K-fold technique, but it's the standard technique and really recommended techniques when you really are, let's say, certain about a couple of models. And on a practical perspective, of course, you would start and training, right, as was alluding to here. So you would train a couple of data sets in order to get a feeling for the data, in order to do some model generation, model development, to really get the hypothesis smaller, because essentially hypotheses are infinite, right? So you could always come up with a new neural network with different parameters, and these are all infinite, but you have to pick some of those and then basically go to the training. Once you're relatively okay with the performance, you then start this proper validation techniques where then 10-fold cross-validation can be used instead of this deval, or it becomes your deval in the sense of doing this 10 times folds and going through the whole training set. Always, let's say, in 10-fold, you can also do 5-fold, but basically in 10-fold, you would have something like you train on 9 and validate on the 10th. And you then, of course, put the validation back in the pot and train on the others, so that you have this fold structure that we have here. You could do also in a way a 1-fold cross-validation. That would mean very many runs, but of course, from the bias perspective that is in the data, taking decisions and doing so many runs would be, of course, perhaps in a sense the ideal thing to do, but you also would waste lots of computational resources for it. So essentially, the rule of thumb in machine learning these days would be 5-fold or 10-fold cross-validation, which is recommended mostly. So by knowing this, the idea is now to think about, again, these numbers, right? So again, the support vector machine is here open source. That's what we already discussed in one of the lectures already. It had lots of problems when you take the original tool, so it's better to take our tool that is maintained by Jülich and Iceland, where we have better load balancing. You see here was a problem with load balancing, which we described also in this publication. There were memory access problems in certain areas, so you really couldn't scale with the PSVM very much. And this had to do with, let's say, programming or parallel programming that we could improve. You remember in lecture 8 in our parallel performance analysis, we looked at this. Instead of iteratively going in a for loop and then do always MPI broadcast, you can do things like MPI or reduce and so on. So these are all elements where, of course, inherently in the algorithms, there was already speed up. We could do this much more quicker. But what I also wanted to leave you on the table here is thinking about this cross-validation. So CV means here cross-validation. So each of these elements here in the table actually are runtimes and accuracy. And you see kernel parameters. Gamma is a kernel parameter and C is a cost, so how much error you allow. In the beginning, you don't know any of this. Every one of those combinations within the grid here is a hypothesis with a specific parameter and a specific cost. And of course, you want to understand which of those combinations might be the best accuracy, which is the 77 here. So when you do this then in serial, let's say we used it here in MATLAB to make a certain point, and MATLAB required 15 minutes around, right? So 14 minutes. And think about that each of this is 10-fold cross-validation. So we don't really have just one run here. We have 10 runs, right? So train on 9, validate on 10s, and then back in the pot and again. So in HPC, we did the same things with 10-fold cross-validation in parallel using our PSVM. And of course, you don't want to drop in accuracy, right? So you have 77% accuracy still, which is basically comparable to the serial. And you break it down to 1 minute, right? So instead of 15 minutes, you get the best parameter set in 1 minute. Now, this is the first good result, of course, right? So this is quite a speed up inherently in the algorithm. But now when you think about that, you do it in the 10-fold cross-validation, it's even one more aspect of it. That's where basically you come to the point that this has so much speed up, because there are lots of potential as you train a lot, right? 10-fold. Now, but the other point is, which gives you the second good result, is that you never know that 108 is here the best parameter set for the support vector machine. This is only something you can explore by doing this so-called grid search here, right? So you try to find the parameters in a systematic fashion, and this requires you to train 10-fold, 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 10-fold in all of these different grids. And if you add all of this up, you would say that all of them are essentially 9 hours in the case of MATLAB. So basically a whole working day means to fill up this grid. And what you can do essentially here in the idea of PSVM, you just break it down to half an hour. Just to give you some numbers to really understand that high performance computing can do here very, very much in order to speed up the process. And of course, now I could go on and basically will say, okay, now we have support vector machines, we have the best line, but what about cutting edge algorithms, especially if you have big data sets? So here's one from the area we work in with remote sensing, where we have quite big data sets. So there we want to have more sophisticated models. We have more data available. And this is something where then practical lecture 10.1 will start, using deep learning really with convolutional neural networks. And of course, convolutional neural networks don't mean anything to you, but they're much more computing and expensive than the support vector machine we just have basically explored. And so he will also explain then what is then the context of the idea of then going to deep learning networks from machine learning, shallow neural networks that requires more and more computing because of optimization, because of things like stochastic gradient descent, gradient descent optimization algorithms that have to knock down the error to make the performance, the accuracy right. This is also something we have already done in one of our previous lectures. The key problem remains, however, in all of these applications, when you do deep learning, essentially, what are these parameters you have to pick? Right, you see here a parameter set, which convolutional filters, and this will be all explained here basically in the following practical lecture 10.1. And we use that incredibly often the ideas for different application problems, and where you also maybe can combine support vector machines with deep learning in other publications. But finding those parameters, so which optimizer to choose, how long you train, these are all not easy questions, which will be now answered then in practical lecture 10.1. Now, thinking about cutting edge deep learning networks, you even have challenges when you just have one GPU. So we will see in practical lecture 10.2 given by Rocco Sedona, who is really an application expert in remote sensing, that ResNet 50 is, for instance, one of the cutting edge examples of doing deep learning. It has 25.6 millions of trainable parameters. And there you come quickly to the requirement that only one GPU would be also not enough. So we have to think about something we call distributed training on multi-GPUs. And this will be the topic of practical lecture 10.2, based also on MPI and the material you have basically learned here in the course. And with this, you're actually able to knock down here significantly the speed up, always knock down the time per epoch, per training, by, for instance, here as this example, 24 nodes, each of them had 4 GPUs, if you remember from Jewels, and then we had 96 GPUs. But by now we have much more GPUs already used, and also Rocco will explain this in the practical lecture 10.2. Interesting for us in the HPC course is really essentially that this is based partly on Horovod, which uses MPI or reduce, but there are also more new, let's say, distributed training frameworks like DeepSpeed, where also Rocco will talk about. To sum up a bit the lecture and the machine learning application domain, I would also shed light now back on the clustering. We discussed a lot about logistic regression, about linear learning models. We discussed about support vector machines, which are not linear. So with a kernel, you have actually highly nonlinear models that you can create, for instance, with a radial business basic function, RBF kernel. So that's just about clustering. And I think this is something what you already know now. You have basically had HPDB-scan in many of the different lectures. We always used it for MPI. We always use it for OpenMP. And then even to say it's for the hybrid computing as well. I brought you a video to really understand the algorithm in itself better. But here you have also seen as an example that even this has nothing to do with classification. Here we just do clustering. And you can come up then to something on top of it, which is classification. So here different cortical layers in the human brain based on cell density, for instance. But this is inherently a clustering problem and before you get there. And you can do this nicely in parallel, as we have also alluded to. You have to be checking about the domain decomposition, maybe with cost strategies here. We talked about the requirement for halo cells, so overlapping regions. Also halos you have learned already. And you do a local scan, maybe with OpenMP, and then with MPI, you merge the halos between the different nodes and cores and have a scaling behavior that you see a little bit here, seeing that essentially the hybrid one really catches out the most here in this particular algorithm, basically bridging back to all the different lectures we had in the first part of the course, seeing that applications here in AI, applications in data science can really benefit from those significantly. And also think about the data a little bit. You remember in practical lecture 5.1, I do some demonstration about HPDB-scan, where also not only the time was important, when you know this do with scikit-learn or with other serial implementations of DB-scan, it will be much more runtime. But also here we use the power of HDF5 of the parallel, let's say, file format, which is of course also a binary file format, so also make it very much faster than just having everything in a text file that is, let's say, human readable. So in a way, just a summary of saying, coming back to all what we learned again and again, and this will be the certain course also for our coming up lectures in lecture 11, lecture 12, we always will link back what was basically in the first part of the course. To the end of today will be a little bit the explanation here about DB-scan. You see already a quite funny explanation of DB-scan, but I put it because it captures the essence in a very short time of this DB-scan clustering algorithm that, of course, we implemented in a more parallel fashion, and that is also open source if you want to use it. So let's look a little bit what DB-scan clustering really means.
DBScan is a clustering technique which can cluster any shape. It is a widely used algorithm and only relies on two parameters, epsilon and minimum points. Epsilon is a distance parameter. You can think of it like a radius from a given data point that broadcasts out in all directions, forming a perimeter around the data point. Minimum points is the second parameter you must specify. Before we get to that, I'll define two key terms. The first I'll call the starting point. The starting point is a randomly selected data point that will attempt to start a cluster. In this image, the green circle represents the starting point. The second term is core point. Core points are data points which fall within epsilon of the starting point. In this image, all gray circles are core points. The white circles are not core points because they aren't within epsilon of the starting point. Minimum points is the minimum number of core points, including the one starting point, that must exist for a cluster to be formed. In this example, there are 7 points within epsilon of the starting point, including the starting point itself. Thus, if minimum points is set to 7 or less, a cluster would be formed. However, if minimum points was set to 8 or more, these data points could not initiate a cluster. Once a cluster is formed, that cluster can continue to grow. Each member of that cluster will broadcast out their own parameters, looking for new data points that could join the cluster. In this step, you can see the core points did in fact find new members to join the cluster. These points have been made blue. All the blue points in this example are considered border points. This means they are part of the cluster, but are not within epsilon of the starting point. Now these new members will cast out their own perimeter and search for even more members to join the cluster, but in this case, they don't find any. Because new members are not found, this cluster is finalized. I've turned all members of the first cluster blue. However, you will notice there are 3 white points still unclustered. Now we will restart the process by randomly selecting one of the remaining unclustered points. I have again designated the starting point green. I won't run through the steps again, but this iterative process continues until every unclustered data point has been looked at. As this algorithm finishes running, it may eventually form multiple clusters, as seen in this example. But note, this red group could only form if the minimum points was set to 3 or less. Now that you understand how DBScan works, I'll show you a start-to-finish visualization of the running algorithm found at naftaliharris.com.
Okay, so that was in a short way the DBScan algorithm, and of course also happy DBScan algorithm was a little bit shorter because one of the ideas, of course, that in your assignment 3 you will basically work yourself with happy DBScan to understand it better, to cluster problems, and then you basically get a much better understanding by really get your hands on as part of the assignment how actually DBScan and clustering will work. So that's all for today. As I said, lecture 10 has 2 more practical lectures to come up to really cover deep learning, to cover distributed training using multiple GPUs for deep learning networks. And as such, basically, we can look forward to our 2 invited lectures and talk to you next time.